The safest place in a kingdom built on secrets is often the one place you should never enter. Emily Carter had learned that lesson long before dawn broke over Blackthorn Citadel, but lessons meant little when fear was chasing close behind. At 21, she had spent nearly half her life polishing marble floors, carrying silver trays, and pretending she was invisible. Invisible people survived. Invisible people weren't questioned when nobles argued in hushed voices behind carved oak doors. Invisible people weren't remembered when mistakes happened. That was how an orphaned Omega Maid managed to remain inside the grandest fortress in the Northern Territories. She kept her head lowered, answered every order with a quiet, "Yes, ma'am," and worked twice as hard as everyone else. Yet even invisible people could have one terrible morning. The palace awoke before sunrise, every hallway humming with nervous energy as servants rushed to prepare for the royal moon banquet. Velvet banners embroidered with silver wolves hung from towering stone columns. Crystal chandeliers caught the first rays of daylight, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from kitchens large enough to feed an entire town. Tonight, governors, pack leaders, and honored guests would gather beneath the Alpha King's roof. Every polished fork, every spotless window, every perfectly folded napkin mattered. Emily balanced a heavy silver tray stacked with crystal goblets as she hurried through the eastern corridor. She counted every careful step across the gleaming floor, reminding herself that she only needed to make it another few hours before the rush settled. Then someone rounded the corner too quickly. A young footman clipped her shoulder. Time seemed to slow as the tray tipped. Crystal chimed against crystal. One goblet spun through the air before striking the marble with a sharp crack that echoed through the corridor. Silence followed. Emily's heartbeat thundered louder than the shattered glass. "What have you done?" Mrs. Hawthorne, the head housekeeper, marched toward her with astonishing speed, her starched uniform as flawless as her impossible standards. Nearby servants immediately looked away, unwilling to be caught in someone else's disaster. Emily dropped to her knees, gathering broken pieces with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry. It was an accident. An accident before the most important banquet of the year." Mrs. Hawthorne's voice sliced through the hallway. "Do you have any idea what those goblets cost?" Emily swallowed hard. "I'll replace them somehow." "With what money?" The older woman's expression hardened. "You couldn't earn enough in 10 years. Several servants exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody ever did. Mrs. Hawthorne pointed toward the opposite end of the corridor. "Don't stand there. Find the inventory master before he reports this himself. If the steward hears about your carelessness first, you're finished." Panic tightened around Emily's chest. Finished. She knew exactly what that meant. Palace servants who lost the trust of the household rarely found another respectable position anywhere in the kingdom. She hurried away before another word could be spoken, her worn shoes slipping slightly across polished stone. Behind her, Mrs. Hawthorne called for someone else to clean the shattered glass. Emily barely heard the order. Her thoughts raced faster than her footsteps. If she reached the inventory office first, perhaps she could apologize. Perhaps the steward would listen. Perhaps today wasn't the day everything fell apart. She darted through unfamiliar corridors she normally never used, passing towering portraits of long-forgotten Alpha rulers whose painted eyes seemed to follow every movement. The palace felt different here. Quieter. Older. The walls carried fewer decorations, and even the air seemed still, as though this wing belonged to someone who valued silence above celebration. Then voices echoed behind her. "Emily!" Mrs. Hawthorne again. "Closer this time. Stop this instant." Emily's pulse leaped. She rounded another corner, searching desperately for somewhere, anywhere, to disappear before the furious housekeeper caught up. Most doors were locked. Others stood open to occupied offices. At the very end of the hallway, one dark wooden door stood slightly ajar. Without thinking, driven only by fear and instinct, Emily slipped inside and quietly pulled it shut behind her, never realizing she had just crossed into the one room in all of Blackthorn Citadel where no servant was ever permitted to enter. Emily stood perfectly still, her hand pressed against the heavy wooden door as silence wrapped around her like a thick winter blanket. She waited for footsteps outside, expecting Mrs. Hawthorne to throw the door open at any second, but none came. Slowly, she released the breath she had been holding and turned toward the room she had entered in blind panic. The chamber was unlike anything she had ever seen. Every piece of furniture had been carved from dark walnut polished until it reflected the warm glow of a single fireplace. Towering bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with weathered volumes bound in leather. A massive stone hearth flickered quietly, filling the room with gentle warmth despite the cool autumn morning outside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked endless forests painted gold and crimson by the changing season, while deep navy curtains embroidered with silver wolves framed the view like works of art. At the center of the chamber stood an enormous four-poster bed draped with midnight-colored fabric, so elegant it seemed almost unreal. There were no unnecessary decorations, no extravagant displays of wealth. Everything spoke of quiet authority instead of luxury. Emily frowned. No ordinary nobleman lived here. Then her eyes landed on the royal crest carved into the headboard. A silver wolf beneath a crescent moon. Her heart stopped. Every servant in Blackthorn Citadel knew that crest. It belonged to only one man, Alpha King Damian Blackwood. The realization struck her so suddenly that she almost stumbled backward. She had entered the private royal chamber. No servant was allowed inside unless personally summoned, and Emily had certainly never received such permission. Fear rushed through her all over again. She hurried toward the door, twisting the brass handle. It refused to move. She pulled harder. Nothing. Somewhere outside, distant voices echoed through the hallway. Guards. Servants. Someone laughed before another pair of footsteps approached. Emily froze. If she stepped outside now, she would almost certainly run straight into Mrs. Hawthorne. If she stayed inside and the king arrived, she could not even imagine the consequences. Her breathing became shallow as she searched desperately for somewhere to hide. Behind the curtains? Too obvious. Inside the wardrobe? It stood partially open, already filled with neatly arranged royal uniforms that would immediately reveal anyone hiding there. Beside the fireplace? Impossible. Her eyes settled on the enormous bed. There was enough space beneath its carved wooden frame for a person to squeeze underneath. She hesitated only a second before dropping to her knees. Her simple gray dress gathered dust as she carefully crawled beneath the bed, pulling herself into the deepest shadows she could find. The polished floor felt cool against her palms. From where she lay, she could see only the edge of an ornate rug and the sunlight stretching across the room in long golden strips. She hugged her knees tightly, praying no one would enter for several minutes. Then she heard it. Heavy footsteps approached from outside. They were steady, unhurried, confident. Not the hurried pace of servants rushing to prepare the banquet. Whoever walked toward the chamber expected every hallway to belong to him. The door opened with a quiet creak. Emily squeezed her eyes shut before forcing herself to open them again. She needed to know if there was still a chance to escape. Black leather boots crossed the threshold and stopped only a few feet from the bed. Even without seeing his face, she recognized the precision of every movement. Someone removed a pair of gloves and placed them carefully on a nearby table. A long cloak settled softly across the back of a chair. The room became impossibly quiet. Emily pressed one trembling hand over her own heartbeat, terrified the sound alone might betray her hiding place. She could only see his boots from beneath the bed, yet somehow the entire room seemed to shift around his presence. Every instinct inside her urged absolute stillness. The Alpha King had returned to his chamber far earlier than anyone expected, and Emily Carter suddenly understood that escaping Mrs. Hawthorne had only led her into a far greater danger. Emily did not dare move even an inch. She counted each heartbeat as though the quiet rhythm inside her chest were the only thing keeping the world from discovering her. Above her, the Alpha King crossed the room with calm, measured steps that carried neither hurry nor hesitation. A chair shifted softly across the polished floor. The faint rustle of heavy fabric followed as he removed his ceremonial cloak after what had likely been another morning of endless meetings before the royal moon banquet. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. If she could remain unnoticed for only a few more minutes, perhaps another summons would call him away. Perhaps she would find an opportunity to escape before anyone learned she had entered the forbidden chamber. Then something changed. It was so subtle that she first believed she had imagined it. The room itself seemed warmer than before. The scent of burning cedar from the fireplace slowly blended with another fragrance unlike anything she had ever experienced. It reminded her of a quiet forest after the first snowfall, fresh pine carried by a cool mountain breeze, clean stone after gentle rain, and the faint sweetness of wild cedar blooming beneath moonlight. It was comforting and commanding at the same time. The unfamiliar scent drifted naturally through the room, carried by the warmth of the fire and the still morning air. Emily tried to ignore it, but her breathing instinctively slowed. She had spent years carefully concealing every sign that she was an Omega. Working inside the royal palace required discipline beyond her age. She never lingered near gatherings of dominant wolves. She always kept to quiet corridors. She trained herself to remain composed no matter who passed beside her. Yet hidden beneath the Alpha King's bed, all those careful habits suddenly felt fragile. The closer the quiet fragrance reached her, the more aware she became of every tiny sound around her. She could hear the soft crackle of the fireplace. She could hear pages turning as though the king had opened a book. She could even hear the steady rhythm of his breathing somewhere only a few feet away. None of it frightened her as much as the strange calm spreading through her own thoughts. She gently pressed both hands together to stop the faint trembling in her fingers. What is happening to me? She wondered. She had been taught that powerful alphas naturally carried an aura of confidence that others could sense, but no lesson had ever described this quiet pull. It did not feel threatening. It felt impossible to ignore. Emily carefully shifted her attention toward the narrow strip of light beneath the bed. She could only see the king's polished boots resting beside the thick rug. They remained perfectly still. Somewhere above, porcelain touched wood as though he had set down a cup. Minutes passed in complete silence. The longer she remained hidden, the more difficult it became to keep her breathing perfectly even. She worried that one unexpected sigh might echo beneath the wooden frame. She silently counted backward from 100, hoping the familiar exercise would steady her nerves. 99, 98, 97. Before she reached 80, another sensation interrupted her concentration. A tiny tickle brushed against the tip of her nose. Dust. She fought the urge to react. Her eyes watered. She pressed one finger beneath her nose, desperately trying to stop the irritation before it betrayed her hiding place. Slowly the feeling faded. Emily released a silent breath of relief. She almost smiled at surviving such a close call when the king's chair moved again. His footsteps approached the bed with deliberate calm. Each step sounded closer than the last. Emily's pulse quickened. She stared at the polished boots until they stopped directly beside the edge of the bed. For one terrifying moment, she wondered if he somehow knew she was there. Instead, he paused as though listening to something only he could hear. The chamber fell so quiet that even the fire seemed to soften its voice. Emily remained completely motionless, praying that the silence would continue. Then, from somewhere beyond the chamber doors, a distant bell rang through Blackthorn Citadel, signaling the arrival of another delegation for the evening banquet. The sound echoed across the palace, but the Alpha King did not move. He simply stood there, thoughtful and still, while beneath him an invisible Omega Maid struggled to keep her racing heart from becoming the loudest sound in the room. The bell echoed through the stone corridors until its final note faded into silence, yet Damian Blackwood remained exactly where he stood beside the bed. Emily watched the polished black boots through the narrow gap beneath the carved wooden frame, her entire body frozen by a fear she had never known before. She had expected him to leave for the arriving delegation, but instead he stayed perfectly still. It was as though the distant announcement had reminded him of something else entirely. Slowly, he turned toward the fireplace. Emily released the smallest breath she dared allow herself. Perhaps he had simply been thinking. Perhaps she had imagined the unsettling pause. Then another sound reached the chamber. 3 deliberate knocks landed against the heavy oak door. "Your Majesty," a calm voice called from outside. "Commander Nathaniel Hayes requests a moment of your time." Damien answered without raising his voice. "Enter." The door opened with practiced care. Emily could only see another pair of boots crossing the room before stopping several feet away. Unlike the king's measured movements, the newcomer's posture carried military precision. "Forgive the interruption," Nathaniel said respectfully. "The southern delegation has arrived earlier than expected. They request confirmation of tonight's seating arrangements." A brief silence followed before Damien spoke again. "That can wait 5 minutes." Nathaniel hesitated. "Is something wrong, Your Majesty?" Emily felt her heartbeat stumble. Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, she heard several slow footsteps crossing the room once more. The king's boots stopped only inches from the side of the bed. She instinctively held her breath. "Do you notice anything unusual?" Damien asked quietly. Nathaniel remained silent for several seconds. Emily imagined the commander carefully studying the room. "No, Your Majesty. Everything appears as it should." Damien's voice remained thoughtful rather than suspicious. "Interesting." Emily's fingers tightened around the fabric of her apron. Had he sensed her presence? She had not moved. She had barely breathed. The chamber had remained silent except for the fire. Nathaniel spoke again. "Should I summon the royal guard?" "No." Damien answered almost immediately. "There is no threat." Emily nearly collapsed with relief. No threat. Those two simple words eased the crushing weight inside her chest, but only for a moment. Damien continued speaking, almost to himself. "I thought I heard another heartbeat." Emily forgot how to breathe. Her eyes widened as panic surged through every careful wall she had built over the years. Another heartbeat. He had heard her. Somehow, through layers of carved oak, thick blankets, and absolute silence, he had noticed the rhythm hidden beneath the bed. Nathaniel sounded puzzled. Perhaps the palace walls are carrying echoes from the servants preparing the banquet. Damien did not respond right away. Emily could almost feel his attention lingering on the bed above her. The silence stretched so long that every passing second felt like an entire minute. Finally, Damien stepped back. "Perhaps." Nathaniel cleared his throat. "There is another matter. Lady Evelyn Ashcroft has requested another private audience before tonight's banquet." Emily recognized the name. Every servant did. Lady Evelyn belonged to one of the oldest noble families in the kingdom, and rumors throughout the palace claimed many expected her to become the future Luna. Damien answered with complete indifference. "Decline the request." "As you wish." Nathaniel paused again before adding carefully. "The council will not be pleased." "The council rarely is." A faint trace of dry amusement entered the king's voice before disappearing just as quickly. "Tell them I will attend the council chamber in 10 minutes." "Yes, Your Majesty." The commander's footsteps retreated toward the door. A second later, the heavy oak door closed once more, leaving the chamber quiet again. Emily silently begged the king to leave as well. Every second inside the room increased the chance that someone would discover her. She counted another 10 slow breaths. Then Damien crossed to a writing desk. Papers shifted. A drawer opened and closed. At last his footsteps returned toward the entrance. Emily heard the soft sound of leather gloves being pulled back into place. The door opened. Cool air drifted briefly into the warm chamber before disappearing as the door shut behind him. Silence settled over the room once again. Emily remained exactly where she was, afraid to believe she had truly been left alone. Nearly a full minute passed before she finally allowed herself to breathe freely. She whispered a grateful prayer under her breath and slowly began crawling toward the edge of the bed, unaware that a narrow blue ribbon had slipped loose from her hair and remained hidden beneath the carved wooden frame. Emily eased herself out from beneath the bed one careful inch at a time, every muscle aching from remaining perfectly still for so long. Dust clung to the sleeves of her plain gray dress, and tiny strands of chestnut hair had escaped the ribbon that usually kept everything neatly in place. She paused beside the carved bedpost, listening for any sound beyond the chamber door. Nothing. The palace corridors that had seemed so terrifying only minutes earlier now felt strangely distant. The room itself had become quiet again, as though it had erased every trace of the conversation that had nearly exposed her. Emily brushed the dust from her apron as quickly as she could. She knew she should never have entered the royal chamber, and she certainly should not remain another second. If anyone found her now, there would be no explanation believable enough to save her position. She hurried toward the door, carefully turning the brass handle. This time it opened without resistance. She slipped into the hallway and gently closed the door behind her until the latch clicked into place. Only then did she finally allow herself a full breath. The corridor was empty. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting bright rectangles across the polished stone floor. Somewhere far below, servants hurried between kitchens and banquet halls while musicians rehearsed melodies that drifted faintly. Through the palace, life continued exactly as it had before, completely unaware that one frightened Omega Maid had hidden inside the Alpha King's private chamber. Emily lowered her head and walked as naturally as she could. Do not run, she reminded herself. Running would draw attention. Just another servant crossing the palace. Nothing more. She reached the service staircase leading toward the lower floors when another maid nearly collided with her. Emily, where have you been? Whispered Clara Bennet, balancing folded table linens against one shoulder. Mrs. Hawthorne has been looking everywhere. Emily forced a weak smile. I became lost in the East Wing. Clara's eyes widened. Today of all days? You are lucky she found another servant to replace you for the morning inventory. She has been furious. Emily nodded gratefully, though guilt settled inside her. She had never lied to Clara before. I should get back to work. You should, Clara agreed. The banquet hall still needs another 100 place settings before noon. Emily hurried downstairs with renewed determination. Keeping busy would help her forget everything that had happened. It had only been a terrible accident. She would finish today's work, avoid the royal wing forever, and the memory would slowly disappear. That was what she kept telling herself as she polished silver, arranged crystal glasses, folded embroidered napkins, and carried trays through endless hallways. Yet every quiet moment betrayed her. Without warning, she would remember the calm stillness inside the royal chamber. She would remember the scent of cedar, pine, and fresh winter air lingering gently around the room. She would remember the impossible moment when the king had spoken about hearing another heartbeat. Each memory returned with surprising clarity, making it difficult to focus on ordinary tasks. By late afternoon, the palace buzzed with excitement as noble guests began arriving from every corner of the Northern Territories. Elegant carriages rolled through the front gates one after another, while banners bearing ancient family crests fluttered above the courtyard. Emily remained inside the servant corridors, thankful that her duties kept her hidden from the growing crowds. She never realized that something precious was missing. Back inside the royal chamber, sunlight had shifted across the polished floor. Damian Blackwood returned only briefly before attending another council meeting. As he crossed the room to retrieve a document from his desk, something caught his attention near the carved edge of the bed. A narrow ribbon of soft blue fabric rested quietly against the dark wood. He frowned. It had not been there earlier that morning. Damian bent down and picked it up between two fingers. The ribbon was simple, worn from years of use, the kind no noblewoman would ever wear. For a long moment, he studied the faded fabric without speaking. Then an almost invisible trace of a gentle floral fragrance reached him. It was delicate, clean, carrying the faint scent of lavender and fresh linen touched by autumn sunlight. Nothing about it was remarkable, yet something deep within him paused. His normally composed expression softened ever so slightly, as though he were trying to remember a melody he had heard long ago. He looked once more toward the quiet space beneath the bed. Suddenly, the mysterious second heartbeat no longer felt like imagination. The blue ribbon rested across Damian Blackwood's palm long after the afternoon sun had shifted across the floor. It was ordinary in every possible way. The fabric had faded from years of careful use, and one edge had been repaired by steady hands instead of replaced with something new. Yet the quiet fragrance lingering upon it refused to leave his thoughts. He had ruled the Northern Territories for more than a decade. He recognized noble perfumes blended from rare flowers, ceremonial oils worn by ambassadors, and the distinctive scents carried by every powerful family. This ribbon belonged to none of them. It carried only lavender, clean linen, and the faint freshness of someone who spent long hours working rather than attending banquets. Damian slowly closed his fingers around the ribbon before turning toward the chamber door. Nathaniel. The commander appeared almost immediately, as though he had been waiting nearby. Your Majesty. Damian placed the ribbon upon the writing desk. Someone entered this room this morning. Nathaniel's calm expression shifted ever so slightly. Are you certain? This was not here before. Nathaniel studied the ribbon without touching it. Shall I question the guards assigned to this corridor? Damian considered the request for a brief moment before shaking his head. No. If someone reached this chamber unnoticed, questioning the guards now will only spread rumors. Then how would you like me to proceed? Damian looked once toward the bed where he had paused earlier after sensing an unfamiliar heartbeat. Find the owner quietly. Nathaniel nodded once. Discreetly. No servant is to be frightened or publicly accused, Damien added. I want observation, not punishment. Understood, Your Majesty. Within the hour, subtle changes spread through Blackthorn Citadel without alarming its hundreds of workers. Captains quietly instructed guards stationed throughout the palace to pay closer attention to unfamiliar movements. Senior housekeepers received polite requests to verify servant assignments before the evening banquet. No one announced a search. No doors were locked. Yet somehow every hallway suddenly felt as though unseen eyes had become more attentive. Emily noticed the difference almost immediately. While carrying fresh candles toward the grand ballroom, she realized 2 palace guards were standing outside a corridor that normally remained empty. Later, when she delivered folded table linens, another steward unexpectedly asked every servant to confirm their assigned workstations before entering the banquet hall. None of it seemed alarming by itself. Together, however, the changes stirred an uneasy feeling she could not explain. Has something happened? Emily quietly asked Clara Bennett while they arranged polished silverware across one of the endless banquet tables. Clara lowered her voice. People are whispering that the royal guard is looking for someone. Emily's fingers froze around a silver fork. A criminal? Clara shrugged. No one knows. They say the king ordered everything to remain quiet. Emily forced herself to continue setting the table exactly as before, but her heartbeat refused to settle. She replayed every moment from that morning inside her mind. Had someone seen her entering the chamber? Had Mrs. Hawthorne discovered where she disappeared? Or had the Alpha King truly heard the heartbeat he mentioned? Across the enormous ballroom, musicians began tuning their instruments as noble guests slowly filled the glittering hall. Emily lowered her eyes and reminded herself to remain exactly what she had always been: invisible. Because if the quiet search unfolding throughout the palace was truly connected to the forgotten ribbon she no longer realized she had lost, then every ordinary step she took brought destiny one step closer to finding her. The royal moon banquet began beneath a ceiling glittering with thousands of crystal lights that reflected across polished marble like scattered stars. Noble families filled the grand hall in embroidered gowns and tailored formal coats, their conversations blending with the gentle music of a full-string ensemble. Servants moved quietly between endless rows of candlelit tables carrying silver trays, fresh bread, and sparkling crystal glasses. Emily Carter kept her eyes lowered as she always did, carefully balancing a tray of warm teacups while reminding herself that tonight she was only another face among dozens of palace workers. That thought became her shield. Invisible people survived. Invisible people were never remembered. Yet despite the noise surrounding her, an uneasy feeling refused to leave. Every time she passed a palace guard, she wondered whether he had been instructed to watch her. Every time a steward glanced her way, she feared someone had discovered the truth about the forbidden chamber. She focused entirely on her work, refusing to look toward the raised platform where the royal family would soon arrive. Then the musicians suddenly fell silent. Every conversation throughout the ballroom faded at once. Hundreds of guests rose together as the great doors opened. Emily did not need to lift her head to know who had entered. The atmosphere itself seemed to change. Calm authority settled over the hall without a single command being spoken. Damien. Blackwood walked toward the royal dais with measured confidence, acknowledging respectful bows with little more than a quiet nod. His midnight blue formal coat carried the silver crest of the Northern Territories across one shoulder, while the polished ceremonial clasp at his collar caught the glow of countless candles. He neither hurried nor sought attention, yet every eye naturally followed him. Emily concentrated on pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups, hoping the king would pass without noticing another ordinary servant. She reached for the final cup when an unexpected warmth drifted through the air once again. The familiar scent of pine, cedar, and cool mountain rain reached her almost instantly. Her hand paused above the table. For a brief moment the crowded ballroom seemed strangely distant. She remembered the quiet chamber, the carved bed, and the impossible stillness beneath it. She silently urged herself to keep moving. Do not look up. Do not stop. Across the ballroom, Damien accepted greetings from several visiting governors before suddenly slowing his pace. Midway through a polite conversation, he became completely still. Nathaniel Hayes noticed the change immediately. Your Majesty? Damien did not answer. His attention shifted across hundreds of guests, servants, musicians, and palace officials as though searching for something invisible. The delicate fragrance carried by the forgotten ribbon had returned. Not from memory, from somewhere inside the ballroom itself. It was faint, nearly lost beneath candles, flowers, polished wood, and expensive perfumes, but unmistakable. Calmly, he excused himself from the governors and followed the nearly imperceptible trail through the gathering. Emily sensed someone approaching before she dared raise her eyes. Her breath caught the instant she recognized the polished black shoes stopping only a few feet away. Every careful lesson about remaining unnoticed vanished from her thoughts. Slowly, almost against her own will, she lifted her gaze. Across the crowded ballroom, surrounded by nobles who suddenly fell silent in confusion, the eyes of an ordinary Omega Maid met the steady silver-gray gaze of the Alpha King. Neither of them spoke. Yet in that quiet moment, while music, conversation, and celebration seemed to disappear into the distance, both understood that the mysterious encounter from that morning had not been left behind inside the royal chamber. Destiny had found them again, this time before the entire palace. The silence stretched across the grand ballroom, so completely that even the musicians lowered their instruments without being asked. Emily Carter stood frozen beside the banquet table, her fingers still wrapped around the silver tray she had nearly forgotten to set down. Every instinct told her to lower her eyes, apologize, and quietly disappear before anyone noticed the impossible attention now fixed upon her. Instead, she remained rooted in place as Damien Blackwood continued walking toward her with calm, deliberate steps. Around them, whispers began spreading from one noble table to the next. "Who is she?" someone murmured. "Only a servant." Another voice answered with quiet disbelief. Lady Evelyn Ashcroft watched from the front row, her confident smile fading as she realized the Alpha King had completely abandoned the conversation he had been having with the kingdom's most influential families. Emily finally remembered herself. She quickly lowered her gaze and bent into a respectful curtsy. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackling candles surrounding the hall. Damien stopped only an arm's length away. For a brief moment, he said nothing at all. His attention rested on the young maid standing before him, taking in the simple gray uniform, the careful posture, and the quiet humility she carried without effort. Then his eyes settled upon her hair. One side had been loosely gathered after the morning's hurried escape. The matching blue ribbon was gone. His fingers slowly reached inside his formal coat. Emily's heart skipped. She feared he had discovered the truth. When Damien withdrew his hand, a faded blue ribbon rested across his palm. Gasps quietly rippled through the nearest tables. Emily stared at it in complete disbelief. Her hand instinctively touched her hair. Only then did she realize what had been missing. All afternoon. "Is this yours?" Damien asked gently. Emily could not find her voice. After several long seconds, she managed the smallest nod. "Yes, Your Majesty." Another wave of whispers spread across the ballroom. Nathaniel Hayes remained perfectly still several steps behind the king, silently observing every reaction in the room. Emily reached forward hesitantly, intending only to receive the ribbon before returning to her duties. Instead of immediately placing it into her hand, Damien paused. His expression remained thoughtful rather than accusing. "You were in my chamber this morning." Emily's face lost all color. She immediately lowered herself into another respectful curtsy. "I am deeply sorry, Your Majesty. I entered by mistake while trying to avoid." She stopped herself before speaking against Mrs. Hawthorne. "While trying to avoid causing more trouble. I never intended any disrespect. I left as quickly as I could." The ballroom waited for the king's response. Several nobles exchanged satisfied looks, already expecting the frightened servant to be dismissed from palace service. Lady Evelyn quietly folded her hands, watching without expression. Damien regarded Emily for another long moment before offering the ribbon back to her. "You left something behind," he said simply. Emily carefully accepted it with both hands. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Instead of ending the encounter, Damien removed the midnight blue ceremonial cloak resting across his shoulders. The rich fabric carried the silver crest of the Northern Territories embroidered across its clasp. Before anyone understood what he intended, He gently draped the cloak across Emily's shoulders. The gesture stunned the ballroom into complete silence. Emily looked up in confusion, unable to understand why the ruler of the kingdom would offer his own cloak to an ordinary palace maid. Damien spoke calmly enough for those nearest to hear, yet clearly enough that his words traveled through the silent hall. No one who serves this palace with honesty should ever stand before this court carrying fear instead of dignity. His silver eyes briefly swept across the watching nobles before returning to Emily. You have nothing to fear tonight. Across the ballroom, conversations stopped completely. No one dared question the Alpha King's decision. Yet behind countless surprised expressions, one thought echoed through every corner of Blackthorn Citadel. The unknown servant whom everyone had overlooked only hours earlier had somehow become the one person in the entire palace who now held the personal attention of the Alpha King. Emily stood beneath the weight of the royal cloak as though the world around her had quietly changed without asking permission. Only that morning she had believed her future could disappear because of a single broken crystal goblet. Now hundreds of nobles watched in complete silence, while the Alpha King himself regarded her with calm certainty instead of judgment. She carefully lowered her eyes once more. Your Majesty, I do not deserve such kindness. Damien Blackwood answered with the same quiet confidence that had filled the ballroom from the moment he arrived. Kindness is not something that must be earned through status. His words settled over the gathering like the first snowfall of winter, gentle yet impossible to ignore. Around the room, expressions shifted. Some guests looked confused. Others appeared thoughtful. Even those who had dismissed Emily only moments earlier found themselves unable to argue with the man who carried the responsibility of an entire kingdom. Mrs. Hawthorne stepped forward at last, clearly shaken. She bowed deeply before the throne. Your Majesty, the servant entered your private chamber without permission. I accept full responsibility for failing to supervise my staff. Damien looked toward the head housekeeper before calmly shaking his head. She entered while frightened, not with dishonorable intent. There will be no punishment. Mrs. Hawthorne lowered her head even farther. Yes, Your Majesty. Emily looked at the older woman with surprise. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Citadel, she saw uncertainty instead of stern authority reflected in the housekeeper's eyes. Nathaniel Hayes quietly approached the king and handed him a small document. Damien accepted it before turning back toward Emily. One final time. Continue serving this palace as you always have. Emily blinked in confusion. Your Majesty? With honesty. He gave the faintest smile. It is rarer than many people realize. Emily pressed the recovered blue ribbon gently against her heart before tying it carefully back into her hair. It no longer felt like an ordinary ribbon. Somehow it had become a reminder that even the smallest forgotten thing could change an unexpected future. As the musicians slowly resumed playing and conversations cautiously returned to the ballroom, the evening celebration continued, but nothing felt quite the same. Noble families who had overlooked the quiet Omega Maid now watched her with respectful curiosity. Servants who had barely noticed her offered encouraging smiles as they passed. Clara Bennett quietly squeezed Emily's hand while carrying another tray, unable to hide her happiness. Across the hall, Damien returned to the royal dais. Yet once before taking his seat, he glanced back toward the young maid who had accidentally crossed his path. Emily happened to look up at exactly the same moment. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Somewhere beyond titles, ceremonies, and expectations, a single unexpected encounter had opened a door neither of them had anticipated walking through. Whether destiny had guided that morning's mistake or simple chance had written an impossible story, only time would reveal. But inside Blackthorn Citadel, people would remember the night when an overlooked Omega Maid discovered that true strength did not begin with power. It began with dignity, compassion, and the courage to remain kind even when no one seemed to notice. And perhaps that was exactly why the Alpha King had noticed her at all. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who believes kindness is never weakness. Tell us in the comments. If you were Emily, would you have hidden beneath the bed, or would you have faced the consequences the moment the Alpha King returned?